Hi, good evening. Can y'all hear me? Well, my name is Rachel Young Fields, and I'm the chair of the Savannah Book Festival Board of Directors. On behalf of my fellow board members and the SBF staff, welcome to the opening night of the 17th Annual Savannah Book Festival. Thank you all for being patient as we had a lot of people to process coming in, and we wanted everyone who wanted to be here to get to be here. So thank you for being patient. The festival is presented by our good friends and Chairperson's Circle sponsors, the Philip E. and Nancy B. Beekman Foundation, David and Nancy Centron, Robert Faircloth, the Courtney Knight Gaines Foundation, Betsy Lancaster, Doctors Mickey and Kristen Ott, the Gerald D. and Helen M. Stevens Foundation, and through an investment by the City of Savannah. Yep. Well, tonight I'm excited to welcome you for our opening address with Ruth Ware to begin what will undoubtedly be another outstanding festival weekend. Before this evening's address, we hosted a reception to honor our literati members, who are the foundation of the Savannah Book Festival. For the past 17 years, literati members from across our community and across the country have faithfully supported our important mission of celebrating the written word in Savannah. Would all the literati members present please stand and raise the lights? Yeah, please join me. Thank you so much for being such a significant support system for the festival. Now, if you're interested in supporting the festival, please consider becoming a literati member. You receive priority seating, advanced ticket sales, and discounts on books. You can learn more about membership benefits at savannahbookfestival.org. I also want to recognize David and Nancy Centron as the generous sponsors of our headlining author, Ruth Ware. So thank you, David and Nancy, for making tonight possible. Each year, the festival relies on a network of approximately 200 volunteers. Without these book lovers giving their time, there would be no festival. So thank you to all of our volunteers, including those serving as your ushers tonight at the Trustees Theater. Please join me in giving a round of applause for members of the Foodie Book Club, Happy Bookers, and Double Booked Divas. And a very special thank you to the 22 authors who have arrived a day early this year to participate in SBF at schools. Through this program, festival authors will visit middle schools, high schools, and universities in our community, giving students a chance to engage with nationally recognized and prize-winning authors and learn about their influences and successes in their writing lives. Thanks to an investment by the City of Savannah and the Landing's Land Lovers, SBF is able to provide copies of the author's books to many of the students participating in the program. We are very proud to be able to facilitate this enriching experience for our local learners. If you haven't already, be sure to download the Savannah Book Festival app, which is an incredibly helpful tool for this weekend with information about authors, times, and venues. You don't want to try to do Festival Saturday without it. So please look in your program for information on downloading it to your phone. We hope you'll be with us throughout the festival, including for our other headliner events, where we will hear from two more New York Times best-selling authors. Jeanette Walls will be here tomorrow night, and David Grant on Sunday afternoon. And please be sure to join us on Festival Saturday, which, as always, is free and open to the public, thanks to your generosity and support. Now, if anyone suggests you do something else this weekend, you know where I'm going with this, let them know your schedule is already fully booked. I'm here to tell you that the future is bright for SBF, and we are looking forward to the next 17 years serving this community and encouraging literacy and the love of books. Before I introduce Ruth Ware, I'd like to remind you to turn off your cell phones, please, and we'd ask you not to use any flash photography. Immediately following her presentation, Ruth will be signing festival-purchased copies of her books. A numbered signing card provided by our bookseller will reserve your space in line. Ruth Ware is the international #1 best-selling author of 8 psychological crime novels. Inspired by one of her favorite childhood authors, Agatha Christie, Ruth published her debut thriller, In a Dark, Dark Wood, in 2015. It was shortlisted for the British Book Awards Debut of the Year, a Sunday Times and New York Times top 10 bestseller, and was optioned for film by New Line Cinema. In the 9 years since her debut, Ruth has averaged nearly a thriller a year, her novels making bestseller lists around the world, earning some people to call her the new Agatha Christie. Her second novel, The Woman in Cabin 10, spent over a year in the New York Times top 10, and last year, her 2019 novel, Turn of the Key, was selected by Time magazine as one of the 100 best mystery and thriller novels ever written. Ruth's books have been published in more than 40 languages, and more than 6 million copies have been sold. Her newest book, 0 Days, is another instant top 10 bestseller and has already been optioned by Universal International Studios for film and TV rights after a 10-party bidding war. Ladies and gentlemen, from Brighton, England, please welcome Ruth Ware.
Well, hello, and thank you so much for this fantastically warm welcome to beautiful Savannah. I am so thrilled to be part of the festival. I took part a couple of years ago when it was online, but it's always been a dream of mine to visit Savannah. So when the festival asked me if I would like to come back in person, I more or less started packing my bags that day. I was, however, slightly alarmed to be asked to give a keynote address. I guess because this isn't really a format we use in the UK very much. I'm super comfortable being interviewed, I love reading, I love answering questions about my work. There will be some later, so please don't hold back. But standing up on stage, listening to the sound of my own voice for half an hour straight, that is not something I've ever really done, and I wasn't completely sure what to say. So, to prepare, I asked the festival if they could tell me a bit more about, the kinds of things that people usually spoke about. And in return, they kindly sent me a bunch of links to recordings of previous speakers. But as I started going through them, I began to get a bit of a sinking feeling. So I think the first one I watched was Diana Gabaldon, and she was erudite and thought-provoking, and she talked about how she came up with her ideas and her research and, her really very stellar academic career and how that fed into her creativity. And just to top it off, she was really, really funny. And then I watched David Baldacci, who was fascinating and thoughtful, and he talked about the myths and reality of what it's like to be a best-selling novelist, and he told stories about his life traveling around the world, and he had all these really funny anecdotes about his family and his writing career. And then, just to complete my spiral of doom, I watched John Grisham, who was effortlessly intelligent and spoke incredibly movingly about his career as a lawyer and how it informed his writing, and he too was extremely annoyingly funny. Did I mention they were all very funny? So basically, at this point, I had sunk into what I believe the writers call a slough of despond, and I was more or less convinced that I had nothing to say and should probably just read out John Grisham's speech and, maybe redact the stuff about his wife and, heroically prosecuting evildoers. Because, of course, that was the problem. and maybe the reason why I wasn't terribly comfortable with the format of a keynote address in the first place. I am not a heroic lawyer. I'm not a fiercely intelligent academic. I am, I guess, a best-selling writer, but that is something, to be honest, I'm still getting used to, even 10 years in. And every time I get invited to something like this, I have the same thought. Why me? Who on earth wants to hear what I have to say about making up stories and writing them down? But then I thought, maybe this is my speech. Maybe this is what I should talk about. Because that feeling of imposter syndrome when someone says, no, we don't want to hear from someone else, we want to hear from you, that I think that feeling of, they can't possibly mean me, is more common than a lot of us realize, and it's certainly more common than most of us admit. And it's a feeling that I've lived with all my life, while simultaneously also pushing against it, accepting the invitation, stepping up to the lectern, sternly telling myself that, yeah, I do have a right to be at this table. But it is also the feeling that stopped me from getting published for well over a decade. Well, that and the fact that the early books I was writing were a bit rubbish, which I think I secretly knew. But here is the thing. I have always wanted to be a writer. I do envy the people who lucked into this career and, woke up one day and found a story lying in their laps, or the writers whose friend bet them that they couldn't finish a novel and they decided to prove them wrong and in the process became one of the best-loved and best-selling writers in the United Kingdom. That is Lisa Jewell and is the true story of how her debut novel, Ralph's Party, was written, and I do hate her a little bit because of it, even though she's lovely. But the truth is, that's not me. I have always wanted to be a writer, right back as far as I can remember, right back, I think, before I almost knew what being a writer was, before I knew that there was a career where people would pay you to write down the adventures of the imaginary characters who even then were wandering around inside my head. And I remember back when I was maybe, 4 or 5 years old, having that conversation with my mum, so what do you think you want to be when you grow up conversation. And I remember saying to my mum, I think I would like to be a writer. And my mum said, which is both great advice, but also possibly a little bit more practical thinking than I really needed, aged 4 or 5, she said, well, I think that's a lovely idea, and I hope it works out. But I think you might find the competition is quite stiff, and maybe quite a lot of other people might want to be writers too. So maybe you should have a plan B, just in case it doesn't work out. So I thought for a bit, and I said, okay, well, if I can't be a writer, do you think there's a job writing the descriptions on the back of other people's books? And my mum laughed and said, yeah, I guess that probably is a job. So I said, okay, if I can't be a writer, then that is what I would like to do. I would like to write the descriptions on the backs of other people's books. And I was about to say the funny thing is, but it's kind of two funny things, really. The first funny thing is that is very close to what I ended up doing before I became a writer. I was a publicist, and I worked in the book industry. And I didn't write the descriptions on the backs of books because that is the editor's job. But a major part of my job was trying to find the words to sum up what is special and unique and important about each of the books that I was working on, and to give people a reason to read them and pick them up. And the second funny thing is that her words must have hit home, because even today, even with 8, New York Times bestsellers under my belt, I do still have a plan B. And I maintain that is solid advice for anyone, and particularly for any novelist. And my plan B, in case anyone is interested, is to become an accountant. It's true. probably one specialising in writers because it's a really funny area of tax law and there's lots of interesting quirks about how writer income gets categorised. And I like all that, and I love a good spreadsheet. Lots of writers do. So if you are a writer and you need a good UK tax lawyer, hit me up after this and we'll talk. But anyway, so to get back to my plan A, that ambition, that need to be a writer, that was always there. And that was me for as long as I can remember. I was, telling my baby sister stories about our dolls and our teddies, and my Barbies always had these incredible Jackie Collins love lives, and they were always feuding and falling in love and suffering near fatal illnesses in these kind of long-running sagas that were worthy of, days of our lives. And as I got older, I started to write these stories down, and they got longer and longer until eventually, I wouldn't necessarily call them books, but they were book-length pieces of writing. But being a writer, that still felt like something that was, out of my reach. We were just a really normal, regular, working family. My mum was a stay-at-home mum for most of my childhood. My dad worked for the county council in IT. We didn't know any writers. We didn't really even know anybody who made their living in the creative industries. And it just felt like that was something that happened to kind of other people, people who were more special or had some indefinable magical quality that I couldn't quite pin down, but I was pretty sure that someone like me didn't possess. But I still kept writing. All through my teens, I was writing these thinly veiled knockoffs of whatever I was reading at the time. I suppose nowadays we would call it fan fiction, but we didn't really have a word for it then. And then as I got older, I sort of started to write more genuinely original stuff, really. And by the time I was in my 20s, I was working in the book industry, not quite writing the blurbs for other people's books, as previously discussed, but something close. And I had maybe 10 or 12 complete manuscripts, which I'd just put under my bed with no real intention of doing anything with them. Because the truth was, working in the book industry was an amazing experience, and I'd got to work with some, huge names, Booker Prize winners, Pulitzer Prize winners, Nobel Prize winners, which was obviously a huge privilege, but did absolutely nothing for my raging sense of imposter syndrome. And I think I basically developed a massive case of stage fright. With every beautiful novel that I was assigned to promote at work, it became harder and harder to imagine that the kind of fairly ugly ducklings on my computer at home had a place on the bookshop shelves alongside these incredible swans that I was promoting at work. And I also had kind of the more cowardly side of me, had this horror of pitching a book to an agent and having them reject it, and then having to go on and work with that agent, or sit next to them at a dinner, and everything being just really hideously awkward. So I carried on writing, and I continued not really doing anything with any of the books, and that might have continued forever, really, except that I had kids. And you hear a lot about writing and having children, and I think ever since Cyril Connolly's famous, the pram in the hall quote, there's been this idea that children, well, maybe anything that kind of steals focus from your art, is the enemy of good writing. But truthfully, I can only say that for me, if I had not had kids, I probably wouldn't be published today. I am, picture the scene, on maternity leave with my second baby. I also had a toddler, and I was about to go back to work at a pretty demanding job, and I had this sudden realization. I realized that my writing, or at least the way I was currently doing my writing, was basically a hobby, and I did not have time for hobbies anymore. I barely had time to wash my hair, let alone go to the gym or write a novel or do anything more self-indulgent. And I can remember really vividly sitting in the library and watching my kids play with the books on the shelves and thinking about a story that I wanted to write, and realizing that as soon as I went back to work, I wasn't going to have time to do this anymore. My days would be filled with work and admin and childcare and trying to get food on the table and all the other 101 tasks that life throws at you. And in that moment, I realized that the only way I was going to be able to keep this thing in my life, at least in the short term, was if I made it pay. And I had to make my hobby earn its keep, ideally enough to pay for an extra day off work and an extra morning's childcare. And that was the only way I was going to be able to keep doing this thing that I loved. Otherwise, I might as well just pack up my computer for a few years. So, for the first time ever, I invested in myself. I bought a laptop to replace the clunky desktop computer that I had been writing on, because it meant that I could tap out stories on the sofa in the living room while my baby napped and my toddler watched TV and played with his toys. I bought a book on creative writing, Stephen King's On Writing, still the only creative writing book that I have read, and I highly recommend it. I bought another book about how to get published with tips for pitching to agents. And for the first time, I wrote a novel specifically intending to try to get it published. And I wrote it fast. We're lucky enough to have pretty generous maternity leave in the UK. But even so, I knew that I had only a few weeks to do this before I went back to work. And then, when my maternity leave was over, whatever writing time I could squeeze in the evenings and weekends. After I went back to work, I edited it and polished it and tweaked it and made it as good as I possibly could. And then I sent it out on submission. I bought the Writers and Artists Yearbook, which is, in the UK, it's like a paper directory of all the literary editors and publishers. And I picked half a dozen agents who I thought sounded promising. And I made what I hoped was a really good cover letter, printed it up. This was back in the days when agents were still accepting paper submissions, which makes me feel like a complete dinosaur. And then I sent my book out, and I waited. And it got rejected, of course. And I felt my old imposter syndrome rear its head and tell me, who was I to think I deserved a place on those agents' lists? And of course, no one thought this book was any good, because it probably wasn't. And the old me would have sighed and put that manuscript under the bed and waited another year, maybe another 5 years. And then perhaps when my kids were a bit older and I had a bit more time on my hands, I would have written something else and done the same thing all over again. But this time, something had changed. Maybe it was me. Maybe having kids had made me a bit braver or a bit more willing to sacrifice my pride for something that I really wanted. Or maybe it was because this time I had written a book I was actually really proud of, a book that I didn't want to just shove underneath the bed. Either way, I didn't shelve this book. I pushed through my doubts. I went back. I looked at the manuscript in the light of the comments that I'd received, and I edited it again. And I asked my friends what they thought, and then I edited it again. And some of the comments I agreed with, and I took their opinions into account, and some I didn't. And that was okay. Not everybody is your reader. Some of them I just thought were plain wrong. But after another year of revising and tweaking and polishing, I sent the manuscript out to another round of agents, and this time it got picked up. I was asked for the full manuscript, and then I was asked for meetings, and then finally, after, I guess, 2.5 years of writing and tweaking and subbing, I signed with an agent. One who loved my work, one who believed in me, and one who wanted to really get cracking. So after that, things moved really quickly. All that time editing and reshaping and talking to my friends must have been worth it, because my agent felt that there wasn't much further tweaking to be done. So she kind of tidied it up a bit, and then she sent the book out to editors. More rejections followed, but also more meetings, more offers, and then finally, at last, I had a publisher, a book deal, and, most excitingly, an advance that meant I could afford to put my now 2-year-old and 5-year-old into nursery for an extra morning a week. To give me that time to write, which was all I had ever wanted in the first place. Because, most excitingly of all, my publishers wanted another book. So that was over a decade ago. And in the years since, years in which I've been lucky enough to make multiple bestseller lists, to travel all over the world, publish in dozens of languages, in that decade, I have had plenty of time to ponder what held me back for so long, and to wonder what might have happened if I had screwed up my courage a bit sooner. In short, to ask myself, why did it take me so long to feel like I deserved a seat at the table? Why did I waste all that time worrying if I was good enough? And would I do it differently? If I could go back, would I push that sense of imposter syndrome aside and say, shut up, you don't know what you're talking about. She's going to be a New York Times bestseller. Her writing's good enough to get published. Would I say any of that to my past self? And the answer is, I don't know. Because in many ways, I think that feeling, that sense of imposter syndrome, is one of the things that I value most about myself. And I know that probably sounds strange, but I'm going to explain. There's a couple of reasons, very different, and I think that they're both valid, and they're both things that I don't want to lose sight of. So the first reason is that I think that feeling of imposter syndrome pushed me to become a better writer. Because the truth was, that voice of doubt in my ear in my 20s was not talking complete bollocks. It was talking some bollocks, sure, but in telling me that, people like me didn't become writers, or that I would never find a place on the bookshelves, or that my writing just plain wasn't good enough to be published, all of that was rubbish. But there was a kernel of truth in there, because back then, maybe my writing was okay, but it wasn't as good as I think in my heart of hearts I knew it could be. And it was that seed of doubt, that little voice saying, is this really the best you can do? That voice was what pushed me to keep putting those manuscripts under the bed, to keep trying again, to keep attempting to write a story that was more gripping and more page-turning and more original, until at last I wrote a book that I couldn't bear to shelve, a book that I thought was worth fighting for. And that voice saying, is this really the best you can do? That voice has not been silenced by me getting published. In fact, if anything, it has got louder. It stayed with me throughout my career. It whispers to me in the middle of the night, mostly at 3 a.m., when I'm too far through a manuscript to abandon it, but not close enough to the end to feel like I'm completely committed. I would be lying if I said I liked that voice, because I don't. It's given me some pretty dark nights and some quite painful moments of self-doubt. But it is also the voice that pushes me to try harder, to do better, to experiment and take risks. And for that reason, I don't want to silence it, or not completely. You often hear rumours about authors who've become, quote unquote, too big to edit. I don't know if they exist, but if they do, maybe those authors are right. Maybe they are geniuses who truly don't need any editorial input. But I don't think many books come out perfect first time. Mine certainly don't. And most books are a kind of fine balance between the arrogance of thinking that you have something to say and the humility of knowing that you need to persuade people to listen. But there's another reason that I want to keep listening to that voice, and it's one that's not actually about me at all, because the flip side of the question, why me? Why do I deserve a place at this table? Is the answer, why not her, or him, or you? The truth is, I have been astonishingly lucky in my career. I have been lucky with my books, I have been lucky with my publisher, I have been lucky with my timing, with the people that I found along the way. And there are plenty of amazing writers who have not been as lucky as me, writers who fully deserve a place at the table just as much as me, but have not been given one for whatever reason. And that is something that I never want to lose sight of. And I think it's maybe what my mum was getting at all those years ago with that Plan B comment. Because I think in that moment, a lot of parents might have gone a different route. They might have felt like the supportive, the encouraging thing to say was, if you work hard enough and dream big enough, you can do anything, or you can be anything you want to be. But the truth is, that isn't always how life works. Sometimes we work really, really hard. Sometimes we give our dream everything we've got, and it doesn't work out for whatever reason. And I guess the dark side of the message, if you work hard enough, you can do anything, is, well, if your dreams don't work out, then that must be your fault. It's not because you are unlucky, or your time just hadn't come, or the world isn't fair. It's because you didn't dream big enough, you didn't work hard enough. And that is not something I think is true. And I don't think it's something that my mum thought was true. So I think in a way that is what she was really saying with her Plan B suggestion. She was saying, yes, dream big, yes, work hard, but if you fail, actually, no, scratch that, when you fail, because you will fail. Everybody fails at some point. I fail all the time, and when you fail, that is okay too. I fail, I screw up, I fall down, I make mistakes, and maybe if you've had that little voice in the back of your head saying, you're going to screw this up, maybe it's actually easier to accept when you do, easier to get back up and keep on going. People often ask me if my books have a message, and I usually say no, or I say something jokey like, get a password manager in the case of 0 Days, or hen nights are horrible in the case of In a ... Wood. But I think the truth is, maybe they do. Maybe there is a kind of message in there. Because I think all my books have one thing in common. There's usually a person at the center of them, usually a woman, who is set a challenge that she knows she is not up to, one that the voice of doubt in the back of her head tells her that she's definitely going to fail, and she often does fail. She makes mistakes, she makes poor choices, something that my characters are sometimes criticized for. She experiences self-doubt, she stumbles, but she gets back up. She keeps trying to do the right thing, make the right choice. She keeps surprising herself. And maybe, in the end, that message is for me. Maybe it's me trying to tell myself, remind myself of something that it took me a really long time to learn, which is listen to that voice of doubt. Learn from it when you can. Let it make you more careful, more diligent, more exacting. But don't let it make you afraid. And never, ever let it shut you up. And ultimately, that's why I'm here. So thank you. Thank you so much. I'm hoping we might have some questions.
So we'll now take a few questions. Please raise your hand and one of our volunteers will find you with a microphone. We want everyone to be able to hear your question. And please limit yourself to one question and leave the storytelling for our good friend Ruth. Anybody have a question? Got one over here.
To what extent and how do you control the translation of your work into the 44 different languages, which I assume you don't speak naturally all of them?
So the question, if anyone didn't hear it, was about the translation of my work into the 44 languages that I am published in, which is something I'm not actually sure I could name 44 languages, so it's constantly incredible to me that my books have been to places where I have never had the chance to go. This feels extremely unfair. Well, the truth, of course, is that I largely don't have very much to do with most of the territories. They just get on with it. So goodness knows what is happening to my books. They could be, rearranging the timelines, changing the endings. I would have no idea, and that's probably for the best. I do get consulted by some translators. They find me on social media and they ask me questions about weird little colloquialisms or, expressions that don't translate very well and ask for my advice. Sometimes they ask for questions about pronunciation because obviously some of the languages that I'm translated into don't use the same alphabet as we do, so there's a certain amount of transliteration going on with the names and things. Oddly enough, the territory that I have the most to do with the translation is here in the United States. And I try as far as possible to make sure that my books are the same, both sides of the Atlantic. It's a peculiarity of American publishers, which doesn't really happen the other way around, that books are Americanized. And in the UK, we tend to just publish American books verbatim, often without even changing the spelling. So we have a lot of, color instead of color. In the US, all the spellings are changed, the punctuation is changed. And there's always a bit of a back and forth about terms which are potentially confusing. And I know that one of the things that readers like about my books is that kind of window into England and, the slang that we use and, little expressions that perhaps don't exist over here. But there comes a point when you risk confusing people. And I think it's Stephen King who said a reader who is confused is not immersed in the text. Someone who doesn't understand what is going on, who is asking questions, is not someone who is feeling. And I don't ever want to pull a reader out of the text and sort of have them confused about what's going on. So very occasionally I will try and tweak an expression, not to the American equivalent, but to something that works transatlantically, put it that way. I'm not wearing my glasses, by the way, so you'll have to forgive me if I'm sort of peering against the light.
Hello, I was just wondering, you said you love spreadsheets. So is that how you keep track of all your fabulous characters? Because I'm having to go back and read and figure out who was what, and they're just perfect. But how do you keep track of all that?
I do love spreadsheets, but actually the truth is I don't use them for plotting at all. Although a lot of writers do, they'll use them for timelines, or one of my writer friends has this incredible document where he has all of the chapters and then within it all of the scenes, and he puts a description for each of the scenes, and I think he like color codes them and checks them off when he's written them. He's a real geek. And he does the same for his word counts as well. He has a whole spreadsheet of word counts and kind of goes through and sort of smugly changes the color coding. I don't do that. Partly because I know that I have a tendency to procrastination, and I think anything like that would just give me an excuse to spend all day changing the fonts on my spreadsheets and not actually writing my books. But also because I don't typically plot very much. I always know the endings of my books. In terms of the mystery, you know, I know who did it, I usually know why, I almost always know how. And I think that's because the kind of books I write, which, you know, are mostly whodunits, it's really important for me to play fair with the reader. I never want a reader to get to the end of my books and feel cheated, to feel like the solution was something that they could not ever have figured out. So I want to drop clues, I want to make sure that I've played fair in terms of giving the reader everything they need to solve the mystery. And of course, that means that some people will get there ahead of me, and that is something I've had to make my peace with, that, you know, readers, especially crime readers, are very intelligent. They read a lot of crime. They become very good at spotting when you're trying to pull the wool over their eyes. But I always want to seed those clues throughout, and of course, you can only do that if you know what the solution is. You can't flag a solution if you haven't figured it out. But everything else is pretty much up for grabs. So I sort of think of it a little bit like planning a journey. You know where you're starting from, you know where you're trying to end up, but everything that happens on the way, the people you meet, the scenery you see, all of that is a surprise, and that's how I write my books. All of that means I don't really keep track of characters. I will sometimes have a little paragraph at the bottom if it's a cast of a lot of characters. One by One had that. The book that I'm about to bring out this summer, One Perfect Couple, has quite a large cast, and so I had a little paragraph at the bottom of my manuscript that just had things like their names and their ages and a brief physical description so that someone's eye colour doesn't change halfway through. But no, I don't use a spreadsheet, and now I'm feeling that that's maybe a missed opportunity.
Do we have any questions up in the balcony? Have one down here in front.
I can see mics moving around.
Yep, we have someone up there.
Hi. So as a reader, we typically will have a book hangover, and it's usually until your next one comes out. So my question is, do you have a book hangover? Like, how do you get over your previous book to move on to the next one?
Oh, wow, that is a good question. Yeah, I do. I guess I do have a book hangover. The thing for me is that it's always a kind of gradual process of letting go, because, so the way I write, my year pretty much always works out the same. I start a new book around kind of November, Christmas time, and I write for sort of 6 or 7 months until about June or July. That is in the UK when our kids break up for school at the end of July. So I try to finish my first draft of my manuscript before the school holidays in July, send it off to my editors, who can then edit it over the summer while my kids are rampaging around the house. And then when they go back to school in September, I can get the edited manuscript back, sit down, start the edits. I edit it in September, October, November, and then sign it off, ready to begin the new book around Christmas time, and the whole cycle starts again. So when I write the end on a manuscript and say goodbye to those characters, it's only a temporary goodbye, because in a few weeks I'm going to be getting that manuscript back again, covered with red pen and comments and, you know, an enormous 9-page editorial letter telling me all the ways in which this book could be better, which always makes me feel extremely depressed for about 2 days. And then, you know, I realize that actually my editor's right and we all want the same thing, which is the best possible book. So in a weird kind of way, by the time I've gone back and forth, and then after the edits are finished, I have to then do the copy edits, which, you know, entails arguing with copy editors about whether the word I think means this actually means this, and maybe I don't know how to use semicolons. Turns out I do not know how to use semicolons. This is something I've had to come to terms with. By the time all of that is done, I am usually sick to the back teeth of this book. So, if, you know, maybe that is the cure for a book hangover, is that if you finished a book you love, maybe go through it and decide whether every semicolon is in fact a semicolon, or as I like to think, could have equally been a dash. So yeah, by the time I get to the end of that process, I'm usually desperate to start the next book and completely sick of this one, which is kind of what allows me to sort of let it go into the world, because I think if I published a book in that kind of first flush of, I've just written the end, it would be so close to my heart that I just the thought of other people reading it would be really vulnerable and exposing. I was heading towards a point there, and I've now talked myself away from it and can't remember what I was going to say. Whatever it was, it's gone. It was obviously not worth making in the first place.
Probably have time for one more down here.
Thank you. Do you have a favorite environment or most comfortable place in which to write, or a time in which you like to write? Is there a discipline about any of that?
So the gentleman's question was about do I have a favorite place to write or a favorite time to write? I do. So my favorite place to write is really in bed, or curled up on the sofa, which was how I wrote most of my first books, usually with a baby in one arm and a toddler hopefully napping, maybe not napping, in the next room. And there's something just really, I think because for me, writing is a very similar pleasure to reading. And that experience of, you know, being snuggled down in bed, and ideally it's a bit cold outside, and maybe the rain is lashing against the windows, which you'll be shocked to learn happens quite a lot in the UK. That is my most favourite and comfortable way of reading, so it's also my most favourite and comfortable way of writing. However, it turns out that writing on a laptop in bed is incredibly bad for your back. Something which I only found out after writing 2 or 3 books like that, and went to the doctor and was like, I don't understand, my back's really bad. And he was like, well, tell me about your desk setup. And I did this kind of little ding. So now I keep my work in progress on my big clunky desktop computer, which after investing in the laptop, as discussed in my keynote, I've actually gone back to the big clunky desktop computer. It only lives on there, and it forces me to work at my desk in my proper setup with my properly supportive chair, which is started off being for the health of my back, but actually, as the years have gone on, I have realized is really important for another reason, which is that I think, and this is not unique to writers, but I think writers are particularly prone to it, but it is now, unfortunately, bleeding out into lots of other professions. We are getting worse and worse at maintaining a separation between our work and personal life. You know, we're all answering emails in the bath, or, you know, waking up in the middle of the night to reply to a Slack memo, or, you know, whatever it is. And I completely understand how we've all ended up in this situation. We've all basically got a little personal computer in our pocket at all times. But I don't think it's a great way to live. You should have time off, time when you are not thinking about work, not worrying about professional problems. And so for me, keeping my work in my office, behind my office door, which I shut at the end of the day when my kids come home, and believe me, they are not interested in my writerly problems, so it's never a topic of conversation after about 5 p.m. It just enables me to kind of keep that separation, keep a little bit of sanity, really, for myself, and not get kind of too bound up in the problems of my characters.
Thank you. We have a copy of the cartoons by Savannah's own Flannery O'Connor to present to you as a token of our appreciation.
you.
Thank you again to Ruth Ware.